And one of the interesting things to contemplate here is the ancient cultures, as we read, the ancient pagan cultures, were terrified of the planet Mars, not just planets in general. That's why the word martial arts is in our vocabulary. That's why Mars was the god of war. Why? Why were these ancient cultures who had less, sophistication than we have, less interest in space, and we think of mass.
Why were they obsessed by it?
They were obsessed. They, in fact, really terrified. They had priesthoods. They had whole rites that were organized. And one of the reasons we discover is apparently there's evidence that the planet Mars interfered in their lives on a periodic basis, so much so as to destroy cities and so forth. And that the orbital relationships, we've learned a lot about orbital harmonics, that the orbits of Earth and Mars intersected and had energy transfers that are recorded through history and account for catastrophes through history. In fact, affected the calendar, because the ancient calendars were tied to either October or March, which was the near pass-by periods every 104 years. Well, the point is that all of this starts to give us a whole different picture of the ancient cultures. And so we're going to get into the mysteries of the planet Mars, not only its orbital situations, but its impact on cultures. And some of this background may be helpful to our understanding some things that are in the scripture, namely Joshua chapter 10, the so-called long day. What on earth is that all about? And this will also give us a background for these press releases we hear from NASA, where they've discovered life on some rock in Antarctica. What's that got to do with Mars? And is there life in the outer space? All this thing is being fed rather aggressively by our space agencies and so forth, to help promote a number of different issues. We're going to explore that because I think it's essential for the biblical student.
As we start the new series, The Mysteries of the Planet Mars.
We'll devote some time to exploring a little bit the planet Mars, both what we know astronomically, also the significance of a number of startling discoveries, also what impact this may have on each of us as we work diligently to try to understand the scriptures better. How do all these things fit together? And so the ancient cultures were terrified of the planet Mars. Why? Why would they worship the planet Mars? And the answer turns out to be that the planet Mars apparently interfered in their lives. It intervened in their lives. See, we would probably argue there's no group that are more space literate than we are. I mean, speaking as a culture over the centuries. We presumably would know more about space and astronomy than all the previous cultures, right? And yet I imagine there's very few of us in this room that could go outside and point to the planet Mars if your life depended on it. It's something that even if you have a telescope, you probably have to consult the local astronomy magazine to figure out where to point it right now, because it moves so strangely, and it's not that important, even if you're interested in astronomy. And yet the ancient cultures trembled before Mars.
Scream in terror, for the day of the Lord has arrived. The time for the Almighty to destroy. Every arm is paralyzed with fear. Every heart melts, and people are terrified. Pangs of anguish grip them like those of a woman in labor. They look helplessly at one another, their faces aflame with fear. For see, the day of the Lord is coming, the terrible day of his fury and fierce anger. The land will be made desolate, and all the sinners destroyed with it.
I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come and see!"
then everyone, the kings of the earth, the rulers, the generals, the wealthy, the powerful, and every slave and free person, all hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they cried to the mountains and the rocks,
"Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it?" Everything they built will fall, and from the ashes of their world, we'll build a better one. Goddamn America! Goddamn America! Goddamn America!
I saw the end of the world. I could feel all this death.
Planet Mars, as you all I'm sure are aware, is the fourth major planet from the sun. It's about half again as far from the sun as we are. It is named after the Roman god of war. And many people will naturally presume that that's just a question of a cultural tradition, that just as the ancients named a lot of things after a lot of their various superstitions and things, it's very possible, as we learn more about the history on the planet Earth of the antics of this peculiar planet, that we may come to the possibility that it was named very appropriately. You see, the strange thing about the planets in general and the planet Mars in particular is that it captured not just the imaginations of the ancient cultures, but gripped them with fear. Most of the early civilizations turn out, if you do your homework, you discover, were terrified of the planet Mars. Now, at first you figure, well, those are just superstitious civilizations. Those are people that for a variety of reasons, were afraid of everything. And these strange wanderers, that's what the word planet originally meant. But the observation that I'd like you to think about a little bit is the ancient cultures were terrified of the planet Mars. They worshipped it. The planet Mars is known as Baal in the Old Testament, and the priests of Baal. Now, the word Baal actually just means Lord, or it's a title in a sense. But you'll discover if you do your scriptural homework that God speaks frequently of the hosts of the heavens, referring to these things, not to worship these things. The priests of Baal had their particular altars and such on the high ground. Often you'll see in the scriptures that the idol worship was in the high places. You'll see the scriptures speak of groves. Now, the primary application of the groves were in effect phallic symbols, the gods or goddesses of fertility, if you will. There are some scholars that suspect possibly some of those groves may have been wooden examples of Stonehenge in the Salisbury Plain in England. There's a monument quite famous as being one of the oldest monuments that's known on the planet Earth. Mysterious Aubrey holes that surround Stonehenge also allow that structure to predict eclipses. Now, archaeologically, we know that structure was built over a 300-year period, strangely enough, and then abandoned. And when you do a mathematical analysis of its ability to predict eclipses, you discover that it predicts eclipses quite accurately, but it makes an error once every 300 years. And so you can only guess at the embarrassment of the priesthood that was in charge when it failed to perform as appropriate, and one can only guess as to what the circumstances were. The main point is the ancient cultures were very, very concerned with the planetary movements. Now, for them to be concerned about the year going by in seasons is understandable because that determined their agricultural success. And so there's much to do with trying to develop correct calendars. But as we start studying calendars, you discover something else that's rather strange. If you look at 14 different ancient calendars, the ancient Egyptian, the Assyrian, the Babylonian, the Hebrew, and the Etruscan, and you can go through a list of 14 of the ancient calendars, you notice something rather interesting about them all. While they had their differences, they all presumed a 360-day year on the planet Earth. And they apparently worked fine up until about 701 BC. In 701 BC, most of the calendars were revised, changed. The Romans added a few days, moving towards what we now know as our 365 and a quarter day annual calendar to get the solar calendar in step with the sidereal calendar. The Hebrews did a strange thing. They added a month every few years on a very strange formula. Now, you can find the rabbinical literature full of speculations. Why did King Hezekiah choose to that peculiar way of reconciling their solar year to the sidereal year? What no one writes about is why did they have to change it at all? What happened in 701 BC? It turns out one of the possibilities is that this was all due, strangely enough, to the planet Mars. So there's all kinds of mysteries associated with the planet Mars, and we're going to explore some of those, particularly ones that would impact us in our lives and understanding of the Scripture. Now, one of the things you should understand, of course, is that Mars was, of course, called Mars by the Romans, Indra in the Indian folklore, Tyr in the Teutonic, Tyr is the transliteration typically. In the Teutonic literature, the genitive form was Teus. And we're meeting right now on a Tuesday night. You may not realize that Tuesday is named after the planet Mars, after the Teutonic tradition, not the Latin or some of these others. Tuesdag was Tuesday. It's derived from the Sanskrit word divas, from which the Romans derived their word deus, or deity. It's interesting that the first month of the Roman year was named Martius, after the god of war. It's where we get the month of March. You say, well, wait a minute, I thought March was the third month in this year. Yes, but that was later. That was in about 364 BC. The Roman calendar was rearranged to make January 1st the first of their year. But prior to that, for some 4 centuries virtually, or more maybe, they had March as the first month of the year. The Anglo-Saxons described March as the lengthened month. That's where we get lengthened monat, or the word for Lent. It comes from the lengthened month. Why is March lengthened? And we're going to suggest the possibility that a near pass-by of Mars was one of the events that God used to respond to Joshua's prayer in Joshua 10, where a day was lengthened. The days weren't long enough for Joshua's battle, so he prayed to God, and we have this bizarre reference in Joshua 10 about the long day. It may surprise you to discover that people with great scientific background take that very seriously and have computer models that tend to support it. Conjectures, but still provocative ones. In Scotland, January replaced March 1st in 1599, and in France, January replaced March in 1564 by Charles IX. It's interesting that Mars is worshipped as Baal or Bel, and also as the calf in India. It's all tied together, strangely enough. The ancient cultures were terrified of the planet Mars. Why? Why would they worship the planet Mars? And the answer turns out to be that the planet Mars apparently interfered in their lives. It intervened in their lives. See, we would probably argue there's no group that are more space literate than we are. I mean, speaking as a culture over the centuries. We presumably would know more about space and astronomy than all the previous cultures, right? And yet I imagine there's very few of us in this room that could go outside and point to the planet Mars if your life depended on it. You know, it's something that even if you have a telescope, you probably have to consult the local astronomy magazine to figure out where to point it right now, because it moves so strangely, and it's not that important, even if you're interested in astronomy. And yet the ancient cultures trembled before Mars. We have today in our vocabulary the term martial arts. It comes from that original relation. If you look through a pair of binoculars at the moon, you can tell that it's been beat up pretty badly. The solar system's a pretty rough place. As we send space probes to all the planets, we notice that their surfaces are incredibly pockmarked. There's been a lot of catastrophes in the past. How long, we don't know. Some of them have occurred in the memory of man. There are over 100 large meteorite craters on the planet Earth, but most of them are hard to find because of erosion and climate effects. But in some of these bodies that have no atmosphere or any other form of erosion, these craters, of course, remain through extended periods of time. In any case, Mars has been a fascinating planet for many, many reasons. In fact, after the invention of the telescope, many features of the Martian surface, see, Venus has an atmosphere, it's pretty thick. Some of the other planets are further away and harder to see, and they're also, although very large, very light. The planet Jupiter would float in your bathtub if it was large enough. It's lighter than water. But Mars has a lot of features on it that you can almost see through a modest telescope. And that gave rise to much controversy. In fact, Italian astronomer and statesman Giovanni Virginio Schiaparelli is famous because he observed about 100 of these features starting about 1877, and he described them as canali, which is a term in Italian meaning channels. Some of these features apparently were perceived as being lines. And it was U.S. astronomer Percival Lowell, of all people, very well-known astronomer, that became the leader of those who believed the markings to be bands of vegetation bordering irrigation ditches dug by intelligent beings to carry the melting ice caps on Mars, carry water down to its deserts and so forth. When you look at Mars, it's easy to start, it's not that clear, it's easy to start imagining things that you see with it, and some of the features on the Mars tend to be suggestive of these things. However, all these controversies that raged for many decades finally were resolved when the orbits of Mariner 6 and 7 in 1969 took pictures and showed that there was nothing representing a network of channels. There are lots of pockmarks and other features, but nothing. That finally buried those ancient myths of canals on Mars. But it's provocative for us to realize that the ancient cultures on the planet Earth, virtually all of them, were not only aware of the planet Mars, they worshipped the planet Mars. And I think that you and I regard ourselves as enlightened of the space age. We think we know a lot about the solar system and the universe and so forth. And yet I suspect there's very few of us in this room that could go outside and point to the planet Mars if our life depended on it. And we don't have a consummate interest in the planet Mars, except in maybe an intellectual academic sense. And the reason is it's not consequential. What Mars does tomorrow or next week or next year has no impact on your life. But the ancient cultures didn't feel that way. The ancient cultures were terrified of the planet Mars. It's reflected in their temples. It's reflected in all kinds of things, in their vocabulary and in their worship. And I'm going to suggest to you the possibility, the reason that's true is the planet Mars in those days intervened in their lives. Now, this is going to take us down a rather strange path. And my motive here is not to necessarily instruct or illuminate as much as just to stretch your imaginations, let you at least be aware of some of the views held by knowledgeable people about some of the possibilities. Because if nothing else, it may broaden your horizon as you read your Old Testament. There's another strange thing that most people don't know, and that is that the planet Mars, well, first of all, as you notice, if you've ever looked through a pair of binoculars at the moon, you see it has a lot of craters. It's been beat up pretty badly. As we send spaceships and explorers to the further planets, we notice something else when they bring back photographs, that all the planets that have solid surfaces have craters, and they're marked up very badly. The solar system is a rough neighborhood. They've had a tough time in their past. Their scars show that. Now, what's going on? What does that imply? There are people that do not believe the universe has always been the way it is now, that it's been subject to a series of catastrophes or cataclysmic events. And people holding those views fall in all kinds of subcategories, but the point is most people, interestingly enough, don't get exposed to some of these views. And interestingly, the more you know about the universe, the more it seems that some of this must have at least some validity.
Our celestial neighbor, the planet Mars. Today, no planet outside the Earth has received more attention than Mars. But the mysteries and theoretical contradictions have grown spectacularly. Astronomers once considered Mars to be a long, barren, and geologically dead rock in space. But since the arrival of our probes beginning in the 1960s, the planet has come alive for us. It does not reveal the inactive and worn-down landscape astronomers and planetary scientists had expected. Nevertheless, investigators continue to apply geologic concepts based on their understanding of the Earth and the Moon. They could only see volcanism, erosion, surface movement, and surface collapse, all punctuated by episodic impacts from space over billions of years. What force created the sharply cut gouges and depressions across the surface of Mars, looking as if a giant trowel descended to scoop out material at radically different and irreconcilable depths? Running north to south, we see massive interwoven scratches or grooves extending hundreds of miles. And how remarkable that a planet only half the diameter of Earth exhibits canyons on a scale dwarfing anything seen on our own planet, and mountains that would tower over Mount Everest. No surface feature on any body in the solar system is more recognizable than the Great Scar of Valles Marineris. And it appears that ancient nations preserved a story about this memorable scar. The scarred face of the Aztec god Xipe, the celestial model of the devoted warrior, is not easily forgotten. And many cultures recall a legendary warrior or giant recognized by his distinctive scar. But could the scarred god really have been the planet Mars? Scarface was the name of a legendary Blackfoot Indian warrior, also called Star Boy. His counterpart amongst the Pawnee was a great warrior named Morning Star, not Venus, they say, but the planet Mars. The Greek Ares personified the lightning weapon, and the Greeks named the god as Mars. When wounded in battle, he rushed to Zeus with the shout of 1,000 warriors to display the deep gash. In the different cultures, the warring god appears alternately as a hero vanquishing chaos monsters and a rogue warrior or dark power. We see the two aspects of the warrior archetype in the Hindu Indra, famed for the cosmic thunderbolt, and the giant Ravana, who is said to have been permanently scarred by the thunderbolt. Greek poets knew the monster Typhon as the owner of a lightning weapon, but also as the lightning-scarred god. And the same is true of the giant Enceladus, alternately said to have been scarred by the thunderbolt of Zeus or the spear of Athena, which meant the same thing. We have good reason to ask, therefore, if the Scarface theme derived from remembered events when planetary gods waged battles in the sky and the planet Mars acquired its unforgettable wound. decades now, investigators have wondered why the two hemispheres of Mars look as if they were formed in different worlds. A southern hemisphere dominated by craters. A northern hemisphere with only sparsely scattered craters. And note the contrasting crustal depths of the two hemispheres. Shallow crust in the north, much thicker crust in the south. Why would a planet evolving in isolation display such a profound dichotomy? It's as if some unknown force excavated the northern crust miles deep. The hemispheric removal of crustal material requires a force external to Mars, acting on the planet. But when it comes to external events, scientific convention has only one thing to work with: random collisions. Could a planetoid or huge asteroid crashing into Mars have removed millions of cubic miles of crust? A shattering impact is all that theory would allow. But what would Martian history look like were we to include electrical events? Events on a scale sufficient to sculpt the surface of the red planet from pole to pole. Of all the enigmatic features in the solar system, perhaps none provokes greater amazement than Valles Marineris. The largest canyon on any planet or moon, the Deep Trench Complex stretches a third of the way around the planet. Hundreds of times larger than the Grand Canyon. It would reach from San Francisco to New York and beyond. Prior theory of planet formation had never anticipated such a chasm on a small planet. What natural force excavated this colossal trench? With the arrival of the Mariner probes, NASA scientists thought the chasm could have been cut by water erosion, though nothing even close was ever achieved by water on the known watery planet, Earth. On any erosional hypothesis, 3 million cubic miles of material were removed. 3 million cubic miles, and it had to go somewhere. Neither the means of fluid drainage nor the vast outflow required are in evidence. Now we know that the Valles Marineris reaches to a greater depth than any outflow channel originally envisioned. And the tributaries imagined by some turned out to be cleanly cut alcoves and stubby depressions. They are not connected to feeder streams at all. One portion of the Valles Marineris system in particular underscores our point here. Planetary scientists acknowledge that Hebe's Canyon, much larger than our Grand Canyon, is an inseparable part of Valles Marineris. As scientists have now acknowledged, it was certainly not created by water. Nor is it plausible to suggest that surface spreading created the massive chasm of Valles Marineris, with its repeated morphology of sharply scalloped walls. The surface was not torn, it was carved, and the detailed images imply a removal of material along the entire length of the chasm, a process clearly illustrated by the neatly machined so-called tributaries all the way up to their rounded, cleanly cut terminations. Whatever formed the canyon complex did not stop at the margins of the primary channel, but added irregular craters and crater chains in surface grooves and gouges. So the question cannot be escaped. Is there anything known to science today that can account for the extraordinary profile of Valles Marineris? There is an explanation well known to science, though it's never entered the geologist's lexicon. Lightning. In the plasma laboratory, its power is demonstrated in electric discharge experiments. But the form unfamiliar to conventional science today is the cosmic thunderbolt. It was the brilliant engineer Ralph Jurgens who first suggested decades ago that a cosmic thunderbolt carved Valles Marineris. With the benefit of more recent data, electrical theorist Wallace Thornhill returned to this extraordinary possibility. Yes, the electric hypothesis will unnerve many scientists, but it is the only hypothesis that meets the test of direct observation. Here is a scar left by an electric arc on a piece of wet wood. Electric discharge provides a direct and complete explanation for the Valles Marineris. The so-called tributaries of the valley were cut by secondary streamers of the discharge. That is a typical signature of an electric arc when it cuts a surface channel. And here is the scar from electric discharge to an insulator. Notice in particular the network of secondary streamers to the left. A perfect counterpart to the western edge of Valles Marineris. It was long held that this remarkable region on Mars was the result of uplift, fracturing, and spreading. And from a distance, it did look like fracturing. But with a closer view in front of us, it is simply irrational to cling to that interpretation. Material has been cleanly removed, exactly as in the discharging to the insulator. The evidence now available demands a new perspective, a larger field of view. Many details of a new interpretation come from laboratory experiments with electric discharge. But how far can this new interpretation take us toward an understanding of Martian history? One advantage of the electrical perspective is that its every implication can be tested against massive layers of evidence now available, including wide-ranging experiments with electric arcs. If, as we've proposed, Mars was immersed in hemispheric discharge, the planet can be viewed as a laboratory in space for testing the electrical hypothesis. As seen in lightning displays, electric arcs exhibit dendritic branching, called Lichtenberg patterns. These look very much like the dendritic erosion created by flowing water. And electric arcs exploding across a surface can produce sinuous channels that also resemble fluid erosion. More than 2 centuries after Benjamin Franklin flew his kite, the origin and behavior of lightning continues to amaze and to puzzle the lightning specialist. Lightning will occasionally imprint its distinctive form on terrestrial surfaces. And even on the skin of humans. It was George Christoph Lichtenberg who in the 18th century first showed that electric arcs create ravine networks on more negatively charged surfaces and elevated ridges on more positively charged surfaces. Could it be that simple? That a cosmic thunderbolt carving Valles Marineris acted on 2 regions of different charge, negative to the north and positive to the south. If such was the case, the only plausible cause of the charge differential would be an electrical exchange between Mars and other charged bodies in the past. And what was the relationship of these events to the hemispheric dichotomies? The removal of crustal material to the north and the densely cratered southern hemisphere. Is it possible to identify the events that shape the surface of the planet Mars? A planet of vast but unrecognized landscapes. Vista after vista, eluding every attempt to explain them. Scientists labor to solve the mysteries through textbook theory. But if, as we have claimed, the cause was electrical, they will never get the expected answers. Keep in mind as well that an electric discharge at energies necessary to create the chasm of Valles Marineris would have ejected great volumes of rocky material into space. Much of the rocky debris would have fallen back to litter the Martian landscape. And indeed, shattered rock of all sizes across the surface of Mars is a long-standing mystery. And the mystery is resolved by electrical events on a continental and even hemispheric scale. Given the energies of the events, considerable volumes of material would have surely escaped the planet altogether. And what might this tell us about the Mars-Earth connection in our reconstruction of ancient events? Or the surprising discovery that rocks from Mars have fallen on our own planet? We have proposed that in a former epoch of planetary instability, electric discharge excavated the Martian surface miles deep, throwing massive quantities of rock into space. This would mean that most of the Martian rocks reaching Earth would have come from well below the surface and would not even bear the atmospheric signature of the planet. So it is not unreasonable to suspect that the planet Mars was not a small contributor, but the greatest contributor to meteoric bombardment of Earth in ancient times. On this question, ancient testimony holds a surprising answer. Worldwide accounts describe apocalyptic wars of the gods, punctuated by lightning and falling stone. Rocks from space falling on the earth have no connection to lightning and thunder in our own time. But the ancient connection is clear. In many different languages, meteorites and exotic rocks were called thunderstones, or thunder eggs, said to have fallen in the great wars of the gods. It seems that the answer lies with the world's first astronomers. They insisted that rocks from space were hurled by the warring thunder god, the planet Mars. From one land to another, ancient sky worshippers celebrated the planet Mars as the cosmic prototype for the warrior on Earth. It seems that rocks encircling Mars, when Mars loomed huge in the heavens, appeared as a fiery retinue of warriors with a blazing countenance. The terrifying Maruts of Hindu literature derive from the same Indo-European root as the Latin Mars. They are the sons and companions of the Hindu Rudra, the Red One, who could hardly be other than Mars itself. The Maruts whirled in the heavens, bringing blasts of fire, of lightning, and falling stone. Babylonian astronomical traditions declare precisely the same thing of Nergal, the planet Mars. Raging demons with awesome numbers run at his right and at his left, the texts say. In the same way, the classical poet described the dwelling of the Greek Ares, the Roman Mars, ringed by 1,000 furies.
Immanuel Velikovsky wrote a book in 1950 called Worlds in Collision, which at the time it was published was poo-pooed and ridiculed, but over the years has gained more and more respect. There's still many people that doubt some of his conclusions, but his research is incredible. He was the one that discovered that about the time of Joshua's long day, there's a legend in China of the long night. And he's the one that, I think, one of the first guys that realized that the Passover in Egypt occurred, of course, from the scripture. We know it occurred on the 14th of Nisan. That was a Shabbat that year. And but, of course, the Jews reckon their day starting at sundown, right? So that night that the death angel passed over Egypt, killing the firstborn of all those that didn't have blood on the doorposts, that was on the Egyptian calendar, it was Friday the 13th. And the reason Friday the 13th is regarded unlucky till this day in the Gentile folklore has perhaps its roots as the Egyptian side of the Passover. But those are all things that Velikovsky's remarkable research pulled together. It's an interesting book. But in 1991, the discovery of a crater under Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula is conjectured to have resulted in the extinction of dinosaurs. I'm not saying it did, but you can begin to realize that the impact that these things can have. A meteoroid of this size, estimated to be over 6 miles in diameter. The energy of the asteroid is estimated over 100 million megatons. That's big. That can alter the orbit of the Earth. Polar instability on the planet Earth has moved many, many times. Now, we've touched on some of these things in our commentary on the long day of Joshua. In Joshua chapter 10, we have this interesting event where Joshua prays and God causes the day to be lengthened. Sun doesn't go down, the moon doesn't move for a substantial period of time in order to finish the Battle of Beth Horon. We talked about that in our commentaries. In the Bible, you should understand that Mars, or its old name was Ares, was pictured as a source of judgment, and that led to an ancient institutional court. And members of that court were called Areopagites, and that's Mars Hill in Acts 17:22 is the vestige of all of that. Dionysus was a member of that sect, as mentioned in Acts 17 in 2 places. Mars is always associated with judgment or war. The word martial arts is still in our vocabulary from these days. And I should mention also the worship of Baal in the Bible. There are several hundred, I think 300 or 400 references to the planet Mars if you understand the allusions in the scripture. And Baal being one of them. In 2 Kings 23:5 and elsewhere, there are a lot of those. You can check some. If you study the Baal, you'll notice that it's always associated with the high places and the worship of the hosts of heaven, meaning which was a term for the planets. Now the question is, what's really going on? Well, as we start studying the planet Earth, we first of all discover something strange about the ancient calendars. It turns out the ancient calendars, like the Chaldeans, the Egyptians, the Hebrews, the Greeks, the Phoenicians, the Chinese, the Mayan, the Hindus, the Carthaginians, the Etruscans, and the Teutons, all of them were built on a presumption of 30-day months, 360-day years. And they apparently worked fine for quite a while, until about 701 BC. In 701 BC, it seems that all these calendars get revised, get changed. The Romans do their thing, they add a few days. The Hebrews add a month every 3 years or so. And the rabbis, the libraries are full of conjectures by rabbis as why did Hezekiah adopt that weird way to bring the solar year into coincidence with the mean sidereal year. It's not every 3 years, by the way, it's a more complicated formula. But basically it's 7 times every 19 years. To bring things into place. Well, what happened? You get the impression something happened that year. But as we look at the original 360 days, the Veda text in India assumes 360-day years. In Persia, 360-day years. In the 7th century, they add 5 days. In Chaldea, of course, 360 days. We know that from the biblical record. In Genesis and Revelation, it assumes a 360-day calendar. In Assyria, it was the 360-day calendar. In Egypt, they had 12 30-day months and eventually had 5 days. And I won't go through all. There's lists and lists of these. Now, what I'm leading up to is some scholars have noted that in the Old Testament, there are a series of catastrophes. And as they look closely and attempt to date these catastrophes, they discover something very intriguing. That these catastrophes are all separated by 108 years or a multiple thereof. As they go back and build this model, the flood of Noah was dated October of 2484, according to one of these studies. The Tower of Babel experience in October of 1944. Sodom and Gomorrah, March of 1879. These are all BC dates. The Exodus place in 1447, or March. The long day of Joshua, it's detailed so much in the Joshua studies, in October of 1404. And Sisera's encounter, a strange passage in the book of Judges. The stars in their courses fought against Sisera. It's in the scripture. I wonder what that means. That occurred apparently in October 1296 BC. And Gideon in October of 1241, and Philistines in 1980, David's catastrophe in October of 972. Elijah in Mount Carmel, that famous event, October of 864. And then the Joel Amos Jonah thing in October of 756, and then Sennacherib, the big thing that finally stabilizes the whole thing in 701 BC. So somehow the ancient cultures were sensitive to something that we don't know anything about. Now, it turns out, as they built these rather elaborate computer models, they discover that it looks like there would be occasions every 108 years that the planet Mars would pass very close to the Earth. And they modeled this very carefully, which side of the Earth and all that sort of thing. And you and I have a tough time imagining that, because we have never personally seen it. But can you imagine Joshua that morning? When a planet that big comes that close, it would involve crustal tides by about 85 feet. Now, you and I experience land tides of maybe a fraction of an inch and don't notice it. We speak of water tides, it's quite a different thing. But crustal tides of 85 feet, the ancient cities, Troy and others, were rebuilt from their own rubble 7 times. These ancient cities were used to being crumbled. There's some evidence to indicate that Sennacherib, when he camped against Jerusalem, was expecting the passing by of Mars, and indeed it came, but not quite the way he expected. Can you imagine Mars rising from the horizon 50 times the size of the moon, accompanied by lightning and earthquakes and volcanic action and what have you, changing the axis of the Earth, thus lengthening the day? There's magnetic evidence of this having happened in history well over 100 times in terms of the polar reversals recorded in deposits on the Earth. Isaiah 24:1 speaks of the earth being turned upside down. Isaiah 24:19, it was removed exceedingly. And that same chapter speaks of it reeling like a drunkard. Now, incidentally, during the long day of Joshua passed by, it is expected that the polar relocation involved over 300 miles of the axis shifting. And that would change the latitude of Jerusalem about 5 degrees. It would also explain that due east would be off about 6.5 degrees. And it's interesting that Dr. Asher Kaufman, as he's puzzled by the non-alignment of Herod's and Solomon's temple, from the inferences that he draws from the foundations, there's a strange enigma, because we know the temple lined up with due east, and yet Herod's temple is off by 6.5 degrees. And one conjecture is that 701 BC pass by occurred between those two temples. So that's, again, a speculation. You know, as you encounter these kinds of ideas, they sound pretty strange. They sound very conjectural. These guys built some very, very elaborate models. Most of you that have read our Joshua notes probably have encountered my bibliographical note by these 3 guys, Donald Patton and Ron Hatch, who worked in those days for Boeing, now works for Magnavox in the Global Positioning Satellite System, and Lawrence Steinhauer, who teaches orbital mechanics at Harvard, or did in those days. These 3 guys published a book called The Long Day of Joshua and Other Biblical Catastrophes, which published the original findings and the models, and I was very intrigued with this, and I made reference to it, of course, as a background item for our Joshua study. And even though I footnote it in my bibliography, many people have written in because they find tough time finding the book because it's no longer in print, and that was sort of discouraging. Well, Don Patton visited our ministry not long ago and acquainted me with the fact that there's a hardback version of that same book. Well, actually, it's also available in softback too now, called Catastrophism in the Old Testament, and where it's been brought up to date. And all that sounds very interesting. You read it, it stretches your horizon. It doesn't mean it's true necessarily, but it's interesting because it's the kind of information you don't normally encounter, and yet some very, very competent people take it very seriously. But it's interesting, their view may be corroborated in a very strange way. The whole idea that the planet Mars, on a number of occasions in the Old Testament period, made near pass-bys by the Earth is a very interesting conjecture. And let's talk about the corroboration first, and I'll show you some implications of it. The telescope was first seriously used by Galileo in 1610. Get a feeling for the ages here, 1610. And with it, he discovered the 4 moons of Jupiter and Saturn's ring, something that's not hard to do with any modest telescope. You can see those things. It wasn't until 1781 that Sir William Herschel discovered Uranus, and then 1787 discovered the 2 moons of Uranus. That's quite out there. That's something. In 1789, 2 more moons of Saturn. Lavier in 1846 discovered the planet Neptune and 1 moon. This is just a rough chronicle of the major milestones in astronomy. But what I'm leading up to, it was Asaph Hall in 1877. That's relatively recent, if you follow me, in terms of astronomical terms. Asaph Hall, who had the benefit of a brand new telescope at the United States Naval Observatory. He made astronomical history because using that brand new super neat telescope at that time, in 1877, he discovered that Mars has 2 moons. And that shocked the astronomical world because no one in the astronomical world to that date was aware of the fact that Mars had any moons at all, because you can't see them very easily. Why? Because they're very small. One is only about 8 miles across. There's another problem. They're almost black. They have an albedo of 3%. Albedo is the reflectivity. In other words, they don't reflect much light. So these things are hard to see. They're small, a long way away, and almost black. But Asaph Hall spotted them both. He named them appropriately for the planet Mars, Deimos and Phobos, which means fear and panic, sort of consistent with the imagery of Mars as the god of war and so forth. Phobos is the darkest object in the solar system. It rotates around Mars in 7 hours and 39 minutes. It moves faster than Mars turns, which means it's the only item that we know of in the solar system that appears, if you're standing there, to rise in the west. You see, it's because it's moving faster than the surface is. You follow me? Now, Deimos does it in about 30 hours 18. It's almost synchronous. In other words, it almost doesn't move at all because it's moving at the same speed that the surface is. Not quite, but close. Now, why am I getting into all of this? Well, because there's a guy that wrote some satire. A guy by the name of Jonathan Swift, an Irish writer. He was a satirist. His intention was to poke fun at London in his day. And so he wrote a series of political satire stories called Gulliver's Travels. Today we think of them as children's stories because we've lost the historical context. They're just fantasies, but they were intended to be political satire. Most of us that are familiar with Jonathan Swift's writings of Gulliver's Travels are familiar with his first voyage of Gulliver, where he lands on the island of little tiny people, and he encounters that. And if you read the narrative, it's Swift's way of poking fun at the culture of that day. But it's the third voyage of Gulliver that most people are not familiar with, but I'd like to read to you just a quick excerpt. Gulliver, in his third voyage, lands in a place called Laputa. And they brag in Laputa that they are way ahead of the astronomers in London. They have made a catalog of 10,000 fixed stars, whereas the largest of ours do not contain over a third part of that number. They have likewise discovered 2 lesser stars or satellites which revolve around Mars, whereof the innermost is distant from the center of the primary planet exactly 3 of its diameters, and the outermost 5. The former revolves in the space of 10 hours, the latter in 21.5, so that the squares of the periodical times are very near to the same proportion with the cubes of their distance from the center of Mars, which evidently shows them to be governed by the same law of gravitation which influences the other heavenly bodies, and on it goes. Now, you may say, gee, that sounds awfully mathematical. Yes, but Swift knew Herschel and those guys, so he's familiar with what's called Kepler's laws. But what's strange here is that he mentions the 2 moons of Mars, and he describes them pretty closely. Not precisely accurate, but too close for comfort. Why am I making a point of this? Because Jonathan Swift, Gulliver's Travels, was published in 1726, 151 years before we had telescopes able to actually see the 2 moons of Mars. Well, how do you explain that? Well, one person said it's the luckiest guess in the universe. I think most of us would consider that absurd. Well, did Jonathan Swift really know there were 2 moons of Mars? Very doubtful, because there's no evidence of that. Well, how did he do this? The conjecture, there's some reason to believe that he had access to notes that he probably didn't take that seriously, possibly some Chinese sketches that he probably regarded as fanciful, and he used them to embroider his fantasy, just to be colorful. What he probably didn't even realize is that they had to be eyewitness accounts. Eyewitness of what? Visiting Mars? No. An eyewitness of one of these near pass-bys. Because if Mars was as close as the biblical narrative seemed to suggest, then it would be possible to see the 2 moons of Mars with the naked eye. And so the interesting account in Jonathan Swift is at least a suggestive evidence that possibly these models that suggest that Mars was on a resonant orbit, passed near the Earth, may have more validity than it would seem on the face of it. Now, there's always a mistake or an error when you read books of the Velikovsky or the Patton ilk, where they look at catastrophism, they can see where maybe natural causes may have been used by God to perform some of the Old Testament events. The long day of Joshua is one example. Another example is Elijah on Mount Carmel. That also happened on a date that was 108-year multiple from the previous pass-by. If we look at that very, very carefully, we notice that the priests of Baal all day ranted and raved, and nothing, of course, happened. But it gets towards evening, and then Elijah finally, it's his turn, and he methodically takes these stones and builds his altar, put all the wood there, then put a trench around the altar. He does something very strange, if you remember the account in your scripture. He douses it with water 3 times. And I always joke when I taught that, because like he's setting up a handicap. He wants God to light off the fire. Why is he dousing it with water? Well, it's like a handicap. I usually, make some flippant remarks about that. Well, Don Patton suggests the possibility. One thing we notice, the satellite Io that's occasionally is seen at Jupiter, there's lightning that occurs between that satellite and Jupiter. You and I don't think of lightning between planets. We see lightning between clouds or from cloud to the earth, atmospheric lightning. But when these planetary bodies get near each other, there often is a huge flux discharge that you and I would call lightning. And Patton conjectures the possibility, maybe God warned Elijah about the near pass-by, and maybe it was a near pass-by of Mars that caused the lightning to be attracted to the watered offering altar, if you will, on the top of Mount Carmel. Just a conjecture, but it's kind of interesting. Another example is in Deborah, where they're fighting Jabin and his 900 chariots of iron. They wouldn't let the Israelis have iron because it was that was the high technology weaponry of the day. But they boasted their 900 chariots of iron. God didn't allow Israel to have iron or horses. They had wood and spears and what have you. Well, it's interesting. One of the conjectures is possibly it was the iron chariots that drew the lightning on that near pass-by. Now, those are colorful suggestions, and possibly God may have used some of these mechanisms in his purpose. However, there's a great risk. While it's on the one hand interesting to examine some of these hypotheses, there's a great risk because you can fall in the trap of denying the supernatural. You see, there's no way that a near pass-by of the planet Mars would make sure that the firstborn of Egypt were killed if they didn't have blood on the door. That's a tough model to build, okay? Also, in the long day of Joshua, whereas indeed it is my personal suspicion that God may well have used the planet Mars to alter the length of that day. But it's very, very hard for us to conjecture how on earth God had the meteorites hit only the Chaldeans and none of the Israelis. That's marksmanship. But as we explore the dimension of time and we realize that God is outside the dimension of time and we are in the dimension of time, it becomes even more breathtaking to realize that those meteorites were put on their orbits maybe thousands of years before Joshua needed them. And God knew that Joshua would have that prayer and that they were ordained by God's purposes in such a way as to accomplish the victories of the Battle of Beth Horon that occupies the conclusion of Joshua chapter 10. The Bible makes it very, very clear that God does intervene in history on the behalf of his people. To attempt to explain some of these things in the Bible by naturalistic means is an exercise in futility. There's no way you can do that. But I think you can err either way. You can err by encountering Joshua 10 and discovering the long day of Joshua and being as a Christian embarrassed by that because it somehow doesn't seem scientific. Wrong. There's lots of evidence there was a long day. And you don't have to stop the rotation of the earth to have one. All you have to do is change its axis over a period of time. But the point is that you can, on the one hand, dismiss these things. On the other hand, you can also go too far the other way and try to explain them strictly on naturalistic grounds. And I think that one of the great differences between the Allah of the Quran and the God of the Old Testament. Many people naively think they're just different language for the same thing. Wrong. Very wrong. Allah is not the God of the Old Testament. The God of the Old Testament is one who makes and keeps his promises. He's one that cares enough about his designs to intervene in history personally. And he has done that many, many times. It's interesting, as we watch him do that, he always does it in such a way as to be weird. He seems to go out of his way to let the foolishness of God put down the wisdom of men. And he seems to embark often using the strangest mechanics when he decides to wipe out the entire planet Earth and save 8 people. He has them build a boat, a barge. And the whole story of Noah is weird, strange stuff. It will serve our purpose, I think, to touch briefly on the days of Noah. We have a little briefing called the Flood of Noah. Tape 2 is the Flood of Noah and the Ark and all that stuff I think what's vastly more interesting is the days of Noah. Why did God resort to a flood? And incidentally, let me touch on something else before I charge down another path here. Some of the catastrophists believe that the planet Mars near Pass-By was one of the major instruments God used to bring the flood. One of the conjectures that doesn't come from this, it comes from some other information too, but one of the conjectures is that there was a comet that passed near Mars. Now, something you need to know in orbital mechanics, there is a thing called the Roche limit. There's a distance, if 2 planetary bodies are coming close to each other, there's a distance at which the smaller one disintegrates. That distance is normally 2.44 radii of the larger planet. And that's what happened to Comet Shoemaker-Levy when it passed near Jupiter a few years ago. It broke into pieces, and it stayed on its orbit. But when it came back 2 years later, its orbit was changed, and it crashed into Jupiter. You may recall all the furor when that happened. It was quite spectacular. Well, the Roche limit is that distance at which if something comes that close. Mars came close to, but not quite, the Roche limit on the planet Earth, back in this closest flyby, it would seem. But the point is, they conjecture that the comet, which is mostly ice, by the way, encountered the Roche limit, fractionated, rained on Mars, melted, became the water that caused the flood, but didn't remain because Mars didn't have the gravity to hold the liquid. But it turns out, Patton believes, for his reasons, that probably co-occurred with the flood on the Earth. And there's reasons why he believes the flood on the Earth was enhanced or brought in part by the near pass-by of Mars. Now,
In its sheer size, the towering Martian mountain Olympus Mons dwarfs anything seen on Earth. The great mound on the Tharsis Rise stunned planetary scientists as it rose through a dust cloud to greet the Mariner 9 mission in 1972. Almost as flat as a pancake, Olympus Mons is 3 times the height of Mount Everest and as wide as the entire state of Arizona. From its discovery onward, planetary scientists interpreted Olympus Mons as a classic shield volcano, comparing it to the great shield volcanoes of the Hawaiian Islands. But Olympus Mons is as large as the entire Hawaiian Island chain of mountains, from the seafloor to their summits. Numerous features distinguish it from any shield volcano on Earth. Its steep scarp rises up to 4 miles high. No shield volcano offers a counterpart to this towering cliff. And a scarp 4 miles high is simply out of the question. In fact, one enigma after another leaps out at the observer. The features of Olympus Mons are, in fact, a perfect fit to an electrical interpretation, down to numerous details. Several years ago, Wal Thornhill conducted a laboratory experiment to demonstrate the effect of an electric arc on a positively charged, or anode, clay surface. At moderate power, the electric arc raised a circular mound from the surrounding material to create both a moat and an encircling fluid aureole extracted from the clay, while also carving a crater on the top of the mound and cutting pits and gouges in its flanks. As the power was increased, the arc briefly stopped moving and burnt a smaller circular crater within the pre-existing crater, leaving a glowing spot. Scaled up to an interplanetary discharge, that glowing spot represents a duration and temperature sufficient to melt the floors of the Olympus Mons caldera craters and to produce their remarkably flat surfaces. Electrical events are scalable, and it should not surprise us to find that events similar to those producing Olympus Mons occurred on a smaller scale as well. In fact, the surface of Mars is replete with small mounds surmounted by craters. Abundant cratered mounds remain mysterious to planetary scientists. Many of these mounds are remarkably similar to raised fulgurites. In many instances, we see the cratered mounds surrounded by moats or borrow pits. An electrical explanation may be the only explanation that can withstand scrutiny.
Mauritania, Africa, there's a mountain range which was dissolved away. There's a crater that they first thought was a meteor crater, but they came back and said no, it isn't, because there's no signature of consite, which is a crystalline form when a crater explodes. That this is not a meteor crater.
Is this the pictures you have here? Are we starting with this picture
Correct.
here? Okay.
Right. This is a plasma discharge crater. Plasma discharge forms a flat area crater, and it dissolves mountains. This is about 300 foot deep.
Now, you're saying
right here in about 25 to 30 miles across.
Now, you're saying, Gil, that this crater is actually in Africa, that this is the location where it hit? Something hit there?
Yes. A lightning bolt. This is the plasma discharge. Remember when the comet Siding Springs passed near Mars just recently?
Yes, I do.
We have a picture that's page 4. It shows when Comet Siding, which is a small little comet, it lit up Mars.
New scientific reports are providing spectacular details on the comet Siding Springs' close encounter with the planet Mars. According to NASA investigators, the effects of the encounter on the Martian magnetosphere were as dramatic as they were surprising. In October of 2014, the comet passed within 87,000 miles of the red planet, and scientists with NASA's MAVEN mission were amazed at the effects on Mars's upper atmosphere. MAVEN team member Jared Espley said in a recent statement, "We think the encounter blew away part of Mars's upper atmosphere, much like a strong solar storm would. The main action took place during the comet's closest approach, but the planet's magnetosphere began to feel some effects as soon as it entered the outer edge of the comet's coma." A statement from the MAVEN team reads, "A Mars comet flyby caused a merging of magnetic fields from the comet and Mars. NASA was in the right place at the right time and was able to study what happens to a planet when a comet comes extremely close to a planet." Earlier NASA reports had described the cometary encounter adding a, quote, "very strong layer of ions to the ionosphere of Mars." The electrical model of comets predicts an electrical exchange between Comet Siding Spring and the planet Mars. When the coma of the comet touched the magnetosphere of the planet, and the two bodies could, quote, "see each other electrically for the first time," the magnetic disturbances and cometary ions in the Martian ionosphere were due to the electric current flowing between the two bodies. In the electric universe, comets acquire a, quote, "negative charge with respect to the Sun in their time at the outer reaches of the solar system. Cometary activity increases as the comet experiences a rapidly rising voltage differential in its environment." It was this understanding that led the Thunderbolts Project's chief science advisor, Wal Thornhill, to successfully predict the advanced electrical flash that stunned NASA investigators when an 800-pound copper projectile collided with the comet Tempel 1 in 2005. For a profound demonstration of a comet experiencing a dramatic voltage spike, let us look back again to the comet Shoemaker-Levy 9's encounter with Jupiter in 1994. At the time, astronomers were predicting that the encounter would be as trivial as pebbles falling into an ocean. However, the energetic effects of the comet fragments were astronomically greater than anything comet scientists had anticipated. As reported by Sky and Telescope, when Fragment A hit the giant planet, it threw up a fireball so unexpectedly bright that it seemed to knock the world's astronomical community off its feet. The electrical phenomena associated with comets may be critical in advancing astronomy to a better understanding of our electric universe.
Okay, I got it. This is actual.
That showed a plasma discharge between the comet and Mars. Well, for this planet, for it to pass between the moon and the Earth, there had to have been a discharge when Earth went through its tail, or whenever it got near enough. We have a crater that signifies that. We can see the same type of craters on the moon. If you look on page 10, you can see plasma craters, which the physicists have identified on Venus, Mars, and the moon. Well, these three planets, Planet 7X passes near them, and it made electrical discharge craters on them also, because they're not concave, they're flat bottom. And that's the difference between a meteor crater and a plasma discharge.
I got it. So a plasma discharge crater. A plasma crater creates a flat, what looks like a flat crater, but it's not down deep into the earth. It's discharge. It's a powerful hit of a bolt of plasma. A crater from a meteorite will literally create a crater that goes down into the earth, and it's quite obviously that something hit the earth that with matter, if you will. So there's a different residue. It leaves a different shape. This is a flat crater compared to a deep crater, which means this was not a crater from a flying asteroid meteorite. This was a crater from a plasma discharge. And you're saying that the same thing happened on the moon when comet sliding spring went by Mars. When it went by Mars, there was an explosion there. It's because it was a plasma discharge. All right, so what Gil is saying is this same crater in Africa created by something that went by the Earth and released a plasma discharge. That same crater is on Mars that just in the last year, that something went by Mars and released a plasma crater exactly like the one in Africa. Well, here's what we know was going by Mars then. The comet sliding spring. And this is actual still shots of, there's Mars, and there's the sliding spring going by. And then there's Mars as the sliding spring gets this close and releases a charge. This is the actual footage. This is the still picture of what it looked like as that comet went by. So his point is this: if this has already happened, if this has happened about a year ago, is this planet on its way toward the Earth right now? And does NASA know it? Does our governments of the world know it? Are they hiding it from us?
From chapter 6 of Revelation to chapter 19, you see all these judgments being released on the earth, and that is a part of the day of God's wrath, the day of God's vengeance, or the day of the Lord.
You hear that like a flash, you hear that thunder roll, can't wait to crash back, this song should come and close, who wrote the righteous path, who had a love one knows, this ain't to crash, relax, yeah, when that trumpet blows, when that trumpet blows, yeah, when that trumpet blows, when that trumpet blows, yeah, when that trumpet blows, when that trumpet blows, yeah, when that trumpet blows, this ain't to crash, relax, yeah, when that trumpet blows.
A number of mounds in the Midwest in America were excavated starting in around 1850. And in many cases, they would find skeletons of people who were in excess of 7 feet tall. And in many cases, they had double rows of teeth, as well as, in some cases, 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot.
Mass graves of giants were opened, some of them extremely large skulls, and extraordinarily, some of these skulls had horns, some had extra rows of teeth.